Imagine standing on your family's ranch, the land you worked your whole life to earn, now facing down a line of armed officers, sent not by the government, but by your own homeowners association. And then, like something out of a movie, Clint Eastwood steps up beside you, ready to defend your freedom. Would you surrender everything to power-hungry bureaucrats who thrive on keeping independent Americans tethered to their systems? This isn't just another HOA horror story. It's a modern-day standoff between one man's right to live free and a corrupt system trying to crush self-sufficiency. I grew up in rural Montana, where freedom was measured in acres and quiet evenings under open skies. My father taught me early, land is freedom, and freedom is what makes us American. I took that lesson to heart. After 35 years working as construction foreman and saving every extra dollar, I finally bought my dream. 15 acres of rugged beauty on the outskirts of Eagle Creek, a modest ranch house, rolling hills, a sky that stretched forever, everything I'd ever wanted. The previous owner mentioned there was a homeowners association, but it hadn't been active in years. Just a formality, he said. The dues were minimal, and no one had enforced the rules in over a decade. It seemed harmless enough. For 2 blissful years, life was exactly how I imagined it. I raised a few horses, grew vegetables, and spent my evenings on the porch watching the sunset. My neighbor, Jim Peterson, became a close friend. He was a retired film industry guy with Hollywood stories and connections, but he'd settled here for the same reasons I had: peace, privacy, and freedom. We'd share beers and stories, him about movie sets, me about job sites and building America. Then it all changed. A new HOA board suddenly took control and called a mandatory meeting at the community center. That's where I met Richard Thornton, the new president. Slick suit, rehearsed smile. Eagle Creek is entering a new era, he declared, unveiling a so-called modernization plan. It wasn't long before their true agenda came into focus. Mandatory hookups to municipal utilities, bans on unsightly agricultural activities, and steep new monthly dues to fund their vision of progress. As I left the meeting, I caught Jim's eye across the room. He just shook his head. We both knew what was coming. Trouble for anyone who valued freedom over conformity. 3 weeks later, the trouble landed in my driveway. I had just finished installing 20 high-efficiency solar panels on my barn. With Montana's long summer days, I'd be off the electrical grid completely. I'd also dug a fresh well on the eastern edge of my land. Clean, deep water, no strings attached. That's when the white SUV pulled up. Out stepped a woman, in a pantsuit with a clipboard. "Mr. Harmon? I'm Sandra Wilkins, compliance officer for the Eagle Creek HOA," she said. "I'm here about an unauthorized structural modification." I showed her my county permits and cited Montana's laws protecting renewable energy systems. She gave a thin smile. Our updated HOA covenants now require board approval for any exterior changes. Section 14.3 also mandates connection to municipal power and water systems. A week later, the first violation notice arrived. $500 fine for unauthorized solar installation. Then $750 for my well. Then $1,000 because my vegetable garden was too large and visible. When I called to contest the fines, I was transferred directly to Thornton. His tone oozed condescension. "These regulations are about consistency and property values, Mr. Harmon," he said. "Your frontier lifestyle is out of step with our community standards." "But these rules didn't exist when I bought the property," I said. "The board updated the covenants last month," he replied. "Perhaps you should attend meetings more regularly. Besides, the northern Montana utilities grid is safer and more reliable. We're only looking out for everyone's welfare." Later that week, I ran into Jim at the hardware store. I told him what was happening. His face darkened. "Thornton's brother-in-law is Philip Morgan," he said, "CEO of Northern Montana Utilities. They control power, water, and gas for 3 counties. Every forced hookup means thousands in connection fees, and then monthly bills for life. This isn't just about you, Frank." Over the next 3 months, I doubled down on my independence, installing rainwater collection, a geothermal heating system, and more. The HOA doubled down to raising fines, sending inspectors onto my land without permission and calling my systems hazards. At a packed town meeting, I realized I wasn't alone. Sarah Jenkins, a 72-year-old widow who'd lived on her pension in a house she'd owned for 40 years, broke down in tears, describing how the new water connection. Sarah Jenkins wept as she told her story. The fees the HOA was demanding would force her to sell the home where she'd raised her children and cared for her late husband. Her son, Michael Jenkins, a respected investigative journalist at the Billings Gazette, sat beside her, silent and grim, scribbling every word into his notebook. She wasn't alone. Marcus Delaney, a Vietnam veteran with a Purple Heart and a fierce streak of independence, stood and faced the room. I didn't fight for this country just to have some bureaucrat tell me I can't harvest sun and wind on my own land, he declared, drawing nods and murmurs of agreement from the crowd. That night, we banded together. We formed a homeowners' rights group and filed formal complaints with the county commissioners. 26 of us signed a petition challenging the HOA's authority to force utility connections on private properties. Thornton's response was fast and brutal. The HOA board voted to place liens on properties with unpaid fines, starting with mine, $27,500 in violations and administrative costs. Then they moved to initiate foreclosure proceedings. 30 days to pay, or they'd take my ranch. This is still America. I said to Jim on the phone that night, there's got to be a way to fight this. Jim paused, thinking, actually there might be. I know someone, an old friend, someone who understands what it means to stand your ground. The foreclosure notice hit like a gut punch. 35 years of labor. Freezing winters on construction sites, blazing summers hauling steel and pouring concrete. Also, a clique of paper pushers could try to strip away everything I'd built. I met with a local lawyer who specialized in property law. Her outlook wasn't encouraging. They were smart, she said, flipping through my documents. The dormant HOA was legally reactivated. They followed the procedures to amend the covenants. Technically, everything they've done checks out, at least on paper. But what about the renewable energy laws? I asked. There might be a conflict with state law, she admitted. That could give us some leverage. But litigation could take years and cost more than the fines themselves. And the conflict of interest? Thornton and Northern Montana Utilities. She shook her head. Unfortunately, that kind of relationship isn't illegal unless you can prove bribery or kickbacks. Just being related isn't enough. I left her office feeling like I was running out of road. Fighting might cost me everything. But paying meant surrendering the very freedom I'd worked a lifetime to secure. Selling? That was never on the table. This land was my retirement, my legacy, my home. The HOA escalated their pressure campaign. Utility workers appeared on my property, marking spots for forced connections. Notices were taped to my door nearly every day. 2 board members even walked into my pasture, claiming they needed to inspect my horses for welfare concerns. That was the last straw. Nobody messes with a man's animals. I installed motion-activated security cameras around the perimeter and posted NO trespassing signs on every fence post. The next time Sandra Wilkins showed up, clipboard in hand, I was waiting at the edge of the property. This is private land. I said coldly, you're not welcome here. She held up a sheet of paper, like it was the Constitution. This authorization from the HOA gives me the legal right to inspect for covenant violations. I looked her dead in the eye. That paper's not worth the ink it's printed with. This is still America. And in America, a man's home is his castle. As tensions rose, the HOA doubled down. They sent certified letters to my neighbors, warning them not to support my dangerous noncompliance. They scheduled an emergency community meeting to discuss public health and safety concerns related to my property. It was a transparent smear campaign, an attempt to turn the town against me. Some people bought the propaganda. Folks who used to smile at the gas station now averted their eyes, but others saw through it. Sarah Jenkins dropped off a homemade apple pie and whispered that her son was digging into Northern Montana Utilities business practices. Marcus and a few of his veteran friends began taking turns driving past my ranch at night, keeping watch just in case. The solidarity meant more than I could say. When day 20 of the 30-day foreclosure notice rolled around, Jim called me. "Remember that friend I mentioned?" he asked, sounding strangely upbeat. "He's coming into town tomorrow. Said he wants to meet you." "Jim," I said, sighing, "unless your friend's a miracle worker or a top-tier lawyer working pro bono, I don't see how he's going to help." Jim just chuckled. "Trust me, this guy's got a way of shifting the odds. Come over for dinner tomorrow at 6. And bring every piece of HOA paperwork you've got. Every letter, every notice, every shred of evidence on Thornton and his brother-in-law." The next evening, I pulled up to Jim's house with a box of documents and a knot in my gut. 10 days left before the HOA could legally take everything. I knocked, half expecting a lawyer or some local activist. Instead, the door swung open, and standing there was Clint Eastwood. "Frank," Jim said with a proud grin, "meet my old friend Clint. Clint, this is the neighbor I told you about." For a moment, I just stared, speechless. Then Clint extended his hand, his voice gravelly and unmistakable. "Jim says you got some trouble with folks who don't respect a man's right to live free on his own land. Why don't you come inside and tell me everything over dinner?" Clint said, holding the door open. Inside, Jim had grilled thick Montana steaks, local beef from another neighbor who was also locked in a quiet war with the HOA. Over plates heavy with food and hearts heavy with frustration, I laid out the entire situation. Clint listened without interrupting, his weathered brow furrowing deeper with each detail. The forced utility connections, the manipulated covenants, the escalating fines, the threat of foreclosure. "I've been dealing with the same kind of nonsense back at my ranch in California," he said at last, his voice low and gravelly, the kind of voice that made you listen. "Different zip code, same principle. People trying to control how free Americans live on their own land." I pushed my plate aside, appetite gone. "I don't get it. I'm not hurting anyone. Why do they care so much about my solar panels? I'm just living the way my father did, the way his father did." Clint leaned back in his chair, narrowing his eyes, the same look he wore in every Western right before things got serious. "It's not about the panels, Frank. It never was. It's about control. Some folks can't stand to see other people living free when they've already traded their own freedom for comfort and conformity. And nothing threatens a man who surrendered more than a neighbor who hasn't." Jim nodded, refilling our glasses. "And in your case," he added, "there's plain old greed. Every independent property is money Thornton's brother-in-law isn't making. Every man who refuses to plug into their system is a threat." After dinner, Clint asked to see the paperwork. We spread the documents out on Jim's dining table. Letters, fines, threats, the supposed inspection warrants. Clint went through each one slowly, his hands rough but careful, his jaw tightening as he read. "This isn't just HOA overreach," he said finally, setting a paper down with deliberate weight. "This is a coordinated effort to push out the self-reliant. They're targeting certain homeowners. Selective enforcement. Shady ties to the utility company. And they're counting on you being too isolated or too broke to fight back." My lawyer said the conflict of interest would be tough to prove. I replied quietly, said it wouldn't hold up in court. Clint's eyes flashed, hard and sharp as steel. "Maybe not in court, but there's more than one way to fight injustice in this country. Sometimes you shine a light on it for everyone to see. And sometimes you make a stand so bold, so unmistakable, people can't look away." We stayed up late, developing a strategy. Jim had media contacts. Clint had influence and experience fighting back against pressure on and off screen. And me, I had the scars, the evidence, and the determination of a man who'd been backed into a corner one too many times. By midnight, we didn't just have a plan. We had a mission to defend the cornerstone of American freedom, the right to live free on your own land. "I want to see your setup tomorrow," Clint said as I was leaving. "These solar systems have come a long way since I installed mine. Curious to see what you built." The next morning, Clint and Jim pulled up to my ranch just after sunrise. I showed them everything: the solar array that powered the house and barn, the rainwater collection tanks, the geothermal heat pump, and the garden that supplied most of my meals. This is what America used to be about. Clint said, inspecting my inverter system. Self-reliance. Building something with your own hands. Not needing a corporation or a bureaucrat to keep the lights on. We were discussing battery capacity and storage efficiency when 3 vehicles rolled up my driveway. I recognized them instantly. Thornton's luxury SUV, a board member's car, and a police cruiser. Looks like we got company, Jim muttered, already raising his phone to start recording. Thornton stepped out first, smoothing his tie. He looked up and froze for a moment when he saw Clint Eastwood standing next to my inverter. The other board member hesitated too, eyes flicking between Clint and the 2 officers now stepping cautiously from the cruiser. To their credit, the cops looked uncomfortable. One, a younger guy with a military-style haircut, kept glancing at Clint like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Mr. Harmon," Thornton began, recovering his composure, "we have a court order authorizing us to inspect your property for code violations. These officers are here to ensure your compliance. Is there a problem here?" Clint asked calmly, his voice unmistakable, gritty and commanding, like a shot of whiskey with a warning. Thornton straightened his papers. "Your off-grid systems are in violation of the HOA's amended regulations and may pose safety concerns for the community." "I've spent the morning reviewing these systems," Clint replied. "What I see isn't danger. I see American ingenuity. I see a man living free, responsibly, and independently. The kind of values this country was built on." Jim moved off to the side, phone still recording. The cops shifted uncomfortably. Thornton glanced toward the younger officer. "Officers," he said firmly, "we have a valid administrative inspection warrant signed by Judge Reynolds. Please ensure Mr. Harmon complies with the court order." Sergeant Mike Davis, the older of the 2 officers, glanced down at his nameplate, then cleared his throat. "Mr. Harmon, I'm afraid we're obligated to let them proceed," he said, holding up the inspection order. Before I could respond, Clint stepped forward, calm but firm. "Before we go any further," he said, his gravelly voice cutting to the tension, "I'd like to understand something. What specific safety concerns justify this level of intrusion?" Thornton straightened his posture, his authority clearly rattled. "With all due respect, Mr. Eastwood, this is a matter between the Homeowners Association and Mr. Harmon." "I'm just a concerned citizen," Clint replied, his eyes steady and unblinking. "One who believes in property rights and due process." Deputy Wilson, the younger officer, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we're just here to accompany the HOA for a lawful inspection, as ordered by the court." Clint gave a slow nod. "I understand you're doing your job, officer, but before you proceed, I think you should all see this." He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. "I made some calls this morning." He turned the phone toward them. On the screen was an email from the Montana Attorney General's office, confirming they had opened an investigation into possible conflict of interest and abuses of power within our HOA. Thornton visibly paled. "It seems," Clint continued, "that the connection between Mr. Thornton's family and Northern Montana Utilities might present a legal issue, especially since that utility just so happens to be the one the HOA is forcing everyone to use." He paused, letting that sink in. "Also worth noting, under Montana law, HOAs can't restrict reasonable energy independence or sustainable practices." Sergeant Davis leaned in to read the email. His expression changed. He looked up at Thornton, now with visible suspicion. "Is this true? Your family's tied to Northern Montana Utilities." Thornton hesitated. His associate, a nervous man with thinning hair, took a small step backward. "Philip Morgan is my wife's brother," Thornton admitted, voice tight. "But that doesn't influence HOA decisions." "Really?" Jim cut in, still holding his phone aloft, recording. "Because I have board meeting minutes where you personally push for mandatory utility hookups without disclosing that relationship." Sergeant Davis folded the inspection order neatly and tucked it into his pocket. "Mr. Thornton," he said, his tone cool, "this inspection will have to wait. Until these allegations are cleared up, I can't in good conscience enforce a warrant that may be compromised by a conflict of interest." Thornton's face turned red with frustration. This is obstruction. I'll report you to your superior." "Feel free," Davis replied, unmoved. Chief Barnes is a big believer in transparency. I'm sure he'll be very interested in this. Deputy Wilson finally spoke up, his voice quiet but steady. "There's also a state law from last year protecting homeowners' rights to install renewable energy systems. My brother had the same issue with his HOA. He cited Montana Code 70-17-807 and won in court." Thornton pointed an accusatory finger at me. "This man has violated multiple covenants beyond energy systems. He's running an agricultural operation in a residential zone." I laughed aloud. "You mean growing tomatoes and keeping 3 horses on 15 acres in rural Montana? That's not agriculture. That's just living." Jim didn't miss a beat. "I think the evening news might be interested in how an HOA is trying to force residents to abandon self-sufficiency to benefit the board president's in-laws." "Turn that camera off," Thornton barked, finally losing his composure. "You have no right." "First Amendment," Clint interrupted. "Freedom of the press. Another founding principle worth protecting." The confrontation ended with Thornton and his associate retreating to their cars, red-faced and promising legal consequences. The officers apologized, then quietly left without conducting any inspection. As the dust settled in my driveway, Clint placed a hand on my shoulder. "Round 1, he said with a faint smile, "goes to the independence movement. But they'll be back. Power and money don't surrender easily." Jim stopped recording and grinned. "Not when they're up against a couple of stubborn ranchers, and Dirty Harry himself." He pulled out his phone again. "I'm sending this to Michael Jenkins at the Gazette and to KRTV in Great Falls. By tonight, this will be everywhere." Jim didn't waste a minute. That afternoon, he edited the footage, highlighting the most damning moments. Thornton's admission, the mention of his brother-in-law, the officer's refusal to act, and Clint Eastwood standing firmly for property rights. Then he released it through every media contact he'd built during his time in the film industry. By sundown, the video had reached every major outlet in Montana. By sunrise, it had gone national. The headline practically wrote itself. "Clint Eastwood stand with Montana rancher against HOA power grab." The response was overwhelming. My phone rang nonstop. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years. Complete strangers from across the country, reporters, veterans, farmers, freedom-loving folks who've been pushed around one too many times. By 7 a.m., a Billings Gazette reporter was parked at the end of my driveway, and then my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. It was a constitutional law professor from the University of Montana. Over coffee the next morning, Jim showed me the video's view count, already climbing past hundreds of thousands. "This isn't just your fight anymore, Frank," he said. "You become a symbol. For everyone who's ever been pushed around by people who think they can dictate how Americans live." The public backlash against the HOA was swift and brutal. Thornton tried to contain the damage, issuing a carefully worded statement. He claimed the HOA's actions were motivated solely by concerns for community standards and safety. But the corporate doublespeak didn't land. It was too late. The narrative had flipped. No one was asking why I had solar panels anymore. They were asking why the HOA president's brother-in-law stood to profit from forcing people off sustainable systems. 3 days after the confrontation, Clint followed through on another promise. He called the governor. Not an old friend, not some Hollywood fantasy, but a man Clint had met at a few conservation events. Someone who respected his decades-long advocacy for land rights and sustainability. The call wasn't recorded, but the effects were unmistakable. That same afternoon, the governor's office announced a statewide review of HOA regulations, with special scrutiny on renewable energy restrictions and conflict of interest. The pressure didn't just build, it ignited. An unstoppable wave of public outrage rolled across the state. Sarah Jenkins' son, an investigative journalist with a knack for following the money, published a blistering expose on northern Montana utilities. His report laid bare a pattern of shady donations to local officials who, in turn, pushed for mandatory utility connections. Meanwhile, Marcus, the Vietnam vet who'd once fought for freedom on foreign soil, mobilized his fellow veterans to defend it at home. They staged a silent protest outside the HOA's emergency board meeting, standing in perfect military formation. Some wore service medals. Many held signs. Freedom isn't free, neither are forced connections. We fought for liberty abroad. We won't lose it at home. A week after the standoff at my driveway, the county commissioners held an emergency session to review the Eagle Creek HOA's charter. They had to move the meeting to the high school gymnasium to fit the crowd. Hundreds of residents showed up, many with their own stories of fines, threats, and overreach. I spoke about the escalating harassment I'd faced. Jim presented hard evidence linking Thornton to the utility company. Other homeowners shared accounts of selective enforcement, intimidation, and violations of their privacy. When Thornton finally took the podium, the crowd murmured with audible disapproval. The confidence he'd once carried like a badge was gone, replaced by thinly veiled hostility. These regulations exist to ensure consistent community development, he insisted. Off-grid systems create visual and functional inconsistencies, even hazards. What hazards exactly? Asked Commissioner Helena Rodriguez. Thornton floundered. Fire risks from unpermitted wiring. Groundwater contamination from unregulated wells. Do you have documentation of any such incidents in this county? She pressed. He didn't. Then came the bombshell. A representative from the state attorney general's office stepped forward. We've received numerous formal complaints, she announced. Many suggest a pattern of HOA authority being used to benefit affiliated individuals and companies. If substantiated, this would constitute a serious breach of fiduciary duty. The final blow came when Clint Eastwood himself called in. His voice echoed through the gym speakers, calm, direct, unmistakable. I've spent decades advocating for conservation and responsible land use, he said. What I saw at Frank Harmon's ranch had nothing to do with safety or aesthetics. It was about suppressing independence for profit. He paused. In this country, we've always stood up against that kind of overreach, whether it comes from government or private interests. That's the American way. The room erupted in applause when the commissioners voted to suspend the HOA's foreclosure authority, pending the state investigation. As I walked out of the gymnasium, people I'd never met clapped me on the shoulder, shook my hand, thanked me. An elderly man with tears in his eyes told me I was standing up for the old ways worth keeping. That evening, I sat on the porch with Jim, watching the sunset glint off my solar panels. For the first time since this all began, I felt something I hadn't in months. Hope. Jim sipped his coffee and grinned. You know what Clint told me before he flew back to California? What's that? He said, this fight is playing out all over the country. People trying to live independently versus those who profit from dependency. Then he said, Jim paused. We might have just turned the tide here in Montana. He looked over at me. All because you happen to be friends with Clint Eastwood. Jim chuckled, shaking his head. No, Frank, this wasn't because of Clint Eastwood. This happened because you refused to back down when they came for your way of life. Clint just helped shine a spotlight. The state attorney general's office moved with astonishing speed. What normally would have taken months, if not years, was fast-tracked under the weight of public outrage and Clint Eastwood's high-profile involvement. Within 4 weeks, investigators had uncovered a trove of damning evidence that turned a case of regulatory overreach into a full-blown corruption scandal. What they found wasn't just mismanagement. It was calculated sabotage, a deliberate effort to dismantle the right to self-sufficiency in the name of profit. Email records, obtained through subpoena, laid bare the truth. Thornton, his fellow board members, and executives at Northern Montana Utilities had coordinated every move. In one message, Philip Morgan, Thornton's brother-in-law and the company's CEO, wrote, Once we force compliance with the water and power regulations, we project a 22% revenue increase. Another was even more damning. Target the self-sufficient properties first. They're the biggest threat to our business model. The extent of the deceit stunned even seasoned investigators. Thornton had quietly accepted over $45,000 in consulting fees from Morgan's company, all while aggressively pushing HOA policies designed to funnel residents into mandatory utility hookups. The board kept a secret priority enforcement list, singling out homeowners with solar panels, wells, gardens, and livestock, while ignoring clear violations committed by the friends and families of board members. Worse still, they had digitally altered official meeting minutes, fabricating records of covenant changes that had never been approved by a homeowner vote. A clear, prosecutable case of fraud. The state's response was swift and uncompromising. The Attorney General didn't stop at civil penalties. He announced criminal charges against Thornton and 3 other board members: fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, corruption, and conspiracy. At a packed press conference that led national news coverage, he didn't mince words. This case represents one of the most egregious abuses of private governance authority I've encountered in my career. In Montana, we value independence and honest dealing. We will not tolerate those who use positions of trust to strip away their neighbors' freedoms for personal gain. Northern Montana utilities face its own reckoning. Investigations by both state and federal regulators were launched, probing for monopolistic behavior, corrupt political influence, and violations of fair trade laws. For me and my neighbors, vindication came swiftly. The Montana Supreme Court, in an unprecedented move, issued an emergency injunction voiding every fine and lien issued by the Eagle Creek HOA under Thornton's leadership. The foreclosure proceedings against my ranch, and many others, were not just thrown out, they were dismissed with prejudice, accompanied by a formal judicial rebuke of the HOA's unconscionable tactics. But the most far-reaching change came next. Sensing a rare moment of political unity, the governor signed an executive order reinforcing the rights of homeowners pursuing renewable energy. Days later, the Property Owners Resource Freedom Act, Prop Act for short, was fast-tracked to the state legislature with overwhelming bipartisan support. The new law explicitly prohibited HOAs from banning or unreasonably restricting solar panels, wind turbines, rainwater collection, or small-scale food production. Strengthen legal protections for off-grid living and energy independence. Establish Montana as a national leader in property rights and sustainable homesteading. Other states quickly took notice, introducing similar legislation based on Montana's model. As for Thornton, he didn't just resign. He fled. The very day the Attorney General's findings went public, Thornton packed up and vanished from Eagle Creek, his reputation destroyed, his career in ruins. His vacant board seat was filled unanimously by Marcus, the Vietnam veteran. With the respect of the entire community behind him, Marcus moved swiftly. His first act as interim HOA president was to disband the old board entirely. Then, he called for a community-wide constitutional convention, a chance for Eagle Creek to reinvent itself from the ground up. The new charter, shaped by direct input from every household, redefined the purpose of the HOA. No more enforcement squads. No more hidden agendas. The new Eagle Creek Charter focused on emergency preparedness, voluntary cooperation, shared community resources, wildfire defense and road maintenance, absolute respect for individual autonomy. Most importantly, it contained a clause that would have once seemed radical. No policy shall infringe upon a resident's right to pursue energy independence, food sovereignty, or self-sufficient living, so long as such pursuits do not infringe upon the safety or well-being of their neighbors. With a single vote, the HOA was transformed from a tool of control into a framework for community resilience, voluntary, transparent, and rooted in trust. As I stood with Marcus at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new community tool library, funded by donations from across the country, I realized something. This hadn't just been about saving my ranch. It had become something larger, a stand, a turning point, a declaration that in this place, freedom still mattered. A homeowner's Bill of Rights, that's what they called it, born from our stand in Eagle Creek. It cemented property owners' rights to autonomy and self-sufficiency. It was more than law. It was a line in the sand. No more forced dependency. No, more hidden agendas cloaked in legalese. It protected the everyday freedom to live on one's own terms. Though the media spotlight eventually drifted elsewhere, the aftershocks of our fight didn't fade. They rippled outward, first through Montana, then beyond. Inspired by what we'd achieved, homeowners across the country began challenging outdated, restrictive HOA policies that stifled energy independence and personal resilience. In rapid succession, Over a dozen Montana counties rewrote local ordinances to ensure HOAs could no longer restrict solar panels, rainwater collection, or off-grid utilities. Soon, national organizations emerged, advocating for self-sufficient living and property rights. And at the center of this quiet revolution was our little ranch. One crisp autumn morning, maybe a month after the dust had finally settled, I was out repairing a fence post when I saw a familiar black SUV pulling into the drive. Jim was behind the wheel. In the passenger seat, Clint Eastwood. "Thought we'd check in on the revolution," Jim said with a grin as they stepped out. Clint scanned the property, his eyes pausing on the solar panels catching the morning light, and the greenhouse standing proudly where no HOA dared interfere anymore. "Looks like independence is alive and well in Montana," he said. We walked the fence line, talking about everything that had changed. The mandatory utility hookups? Gone. Sarah Jenkins, now in her 70s, had her own small solar array installed thanks to a new state grant program. Neighbors were trading seeds, sharing tools, co-hosting gardening workshops. This is how communities are supposed to work, Clint said as we reached my back porch. Built on cooperation, not coercion. That evening, we gathered for dinner at my place. Me, Jim, Clint, Marcus, Sarah, and several others who had stood their ground beside us. We shared a meal grown from our own soil, raised under our own care. It wasn't just food. It was a quiet celebration of what we reclaimed. Clint raised his glass as the sunset lit the mountains in gold and violet. "You know," he said, "throughout history there's always been this battle between those who seek independence and those who profit from dependence. That fight never ends. But it's always worth having." Marcus nodded. "To freedom, not just the kind in history books. The everyday kind, the kind you feel. And to unlikely allies," Sarah added, smiling toward Clint. "Sometimes help shows up where you least expect it." Later that night, I stepped out alone to the edge of my land. The stars had emerged, clear and cold above the mountains. My horses grazed peacefully in the pasture. In the distance, the lights of Eagle Creek twinkled like echoes of the heavens. Everything, the land, the animals, the renewable systems that powered us, the neighbors who had become friends, stood as testament to something bigger than any one person, the American spirit, because independence isn't just ink on a parchment. It's a fire in the soul of those who refuse to surrender. The months that followed brought lasting change. Thornton and his allies faced justice. Stiff financial penalties, public disgrace, and in Morgan's case, the loss of multiple municipal contracts as investigators unearthed deeper layers of corruption. Northern Montana Utilities underwent a full leadership overhaul. Their new president, bowing to public and shareholder pressure, publicly endorsed consumer choice and energy independence. Meanwhile, across the state, HOA reform had become a rare point of bipartisan unity. Transparency mandates, new limits on HOA power, and the widespread adoption of the Property Owners Resource Freedom Act all followed in quick succession. It became a template for other rural states grappling with similar tensions between self-reliance and centralized control. Back home, life returned to the rhythm I'd always sought. My solar panels caught the Montana sun without harassment. My well pumped clean water without a monthly bill. My garden expanded to provide for neighbors in need. Sarah Jenkins didn't have to sell her home, and even installed her own modest energy system with help from Marcus and a few willing hands. Her son, Michael, won a regional journalism award for his coverage of our struggle. Marcus Delaney continued leading the reimagined HOA, now called the Eagle Creek Community Association, with quiet honor and steadiness. Under his guidance, the group abandoned enforcement in favor of service, road maintenance, wildfire preparedness, skill-sharing workshops, seasonal potlucks, a mutual aid network for elderly residents. It became what an HOA should have been all along, a means to lift each other up, not push each other down. Jim and I stayed close. We often sat on the porch, sipping coffee and remembering the day Clint Eastwood stood on my front lawn, ready to make a point no one would forget. Clint still called once in a while, just to check in, but the most powerful change wasn't the laws, or the headlines, or the companies that bowed to public will. It was in the people. Where there had once been isolation, there was now connection. Where there had been fear, there was resolve. Strangers had become allies. Neighbors had become family. And our quiet corner of Montana had become a symbol, not of rebellion, but of restoration. And my ranch, it still stands, not just as my home, but as a monument to what happens when ordinary people refuse to be trampled, to what happens when forgotten American values find their defenders, when a man says, "Not here, not today, not without a fight." Visitors still come sometimes, drawn by the legend of the standoff. They expect to find a battleground. What they find instead is something more enduring, an American homestead, where freedom is practiced daily in the simplest, most powerful ways. So remember this. When they come and take what's yours, when they try to control how free men and women live, you don't need to be famous or powerful. You just need to stand firm, because when you do, you'll find something surprising. You're not alone.